Okay, so I'm Daisy Diaz-Strong. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I'm also on the governing board of the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood. We've been coordinating these webinars, and so I'm really excited today, as I said, to bring Chiara Galli. When we talk about emerging adulthood, the transition to adulthood, the lives of adults, one of the things that we often want to highlight is the diversity of the experiences, and in particularly those who are marginalized in some way. And so I think Chiara's work really speaks to to a group of young people who encounter all sorts of barriers as they're coming of age, as she will speak about today. So I'm really excited to have you here, Chiara. I'm going to do a quick read of your bio, and then I will go ahead and let you share your presentation. Couple of just logistics before we start. Any questions that you have, go ahead and drop them in the chat. And then when Chiara is ready for the Q&A, I will go ahead and read off your questions. All right, so Dr. Chiara Galli is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago in the Comparative Human Development Department, and is also a faculty scholar with the American Bar Foundation's Access to Justice Scholars Program for the 23-24 year. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2020, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell from 2020 to 2022. Her research on Latin American migration to the US has been supported by several funding agencies, including the National Science Foundation, and has been published in various academic journals, as well as in the form of book chapters, policy reports, and op-eds. She is the author of the book Precarious Protections, Unaccompanied Minors Seeking Asylum in the United States, and she'll be sharing a chapter from that book today. It is an ethnography that chronicles the experiences and perspectives of Central American unaccompanied minors and their immigration attorneys as they pursue applications for refugee status in the U.S. asylum process. And she has a beautiful cover from her book that she just showed. All right, so with that, go ahead, Chiara.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Daisy, for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today and to share some of the findings from my research with you. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. Whoops, I got ahead of myself. There we go. All right, so I'll be sharing some of the findings from my book, Precarious Protections, which is an ethnography that chronicles the experiences and perspectives of Central American unaccompanied minors and their immigration attorneys as they navigate applications for refugee status in the U.S. asylum process. And this is the beautiful cover that Daisy was just mentioning. And I'll say the cover art was done by Salvadoran artist based in LA called Victor Iteriano, and he has some really wonderful art if you want to check out his work. He has a website. All right, so child migration is on the rise worldwide. But while in the past, children displaced by violence remained in refugee camps in the global south or migrated to countries like the US through government-sponsored resettlement programs, today, more children than ever before are crossing international borders alone to seek asylum in rich liberal democracies in the global north. In the US, since we started keeping count, nearly 1 million unaccompanied minors have arrived at the border with Mexico. Their asylum applications have since increased exponentially from just a few hundred to several thousands per year. Most of these youths come from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, countries that have some of the highest murder rates in the world, where teenagers are especially at risk of being targeted and victimized and forcibly recruited by gangs. And indeed, 2/3 of unaccompanied minors arriving in the United States are teenagers ages 15 to 17. So U.S. advocates for unaccompanied minors have secured some major gains, such as funding to represent these children in deportation proceedings, and a series of laws that grant these children some due process protections as asylum seekers that adults lacked, and exempt them from some enforcement policies that target adults at the border and in detention facilities. And yet, because children's rights are fundamentally at odds with the state's prerogative to restrict unauthorized migration, in my book, I demonstrate that these hard-won protections are actually precarious when they're implemented in practice. So to illustrate the trajectories that unaccompanied minors undertake from their escape from violence in the home country and through and as they navigate, the maze-like legal process in the United States, I want to share with you the story of one of my research participants, a young woman who I call Joselyn. So Joselyn's mother migrated to the US when she was just a baby. She stayed behind in El Salvador, where she was raised by her grandmother, whom she considered to be, quote, her real mom. Joselyn also felt close to her aunt in the US, who called her often and sent remittances. When she was 12 years old, Joselyn stopped going to school. One of her classmates had been murdered by MS-13 gang members, and her grandmother thought it was no longer safe for her to attend. So she would spend the next 3 years barely leaving her home before she finally fled the country in 2015. The violence in her hometown had escalated by then, a microcosm of the national trends of rising homicide rates in El Salvador during that year. In the meantime, Joselyn's aunt in the US had been saving up for her quinceañera, a rite of passage that marks the life course transition from girlhood to womanhood all over Latin America. And yet violence had put Joselyn's coming of age on hold. She had left school, but she was unable to work. And so her family decided to use the quinceañera savings to extract Joselyn from her risky life as a teenager in El Salvador instead. They paid a coyote to smuggle Joselyn out of the country, leading her along the dangerous, unauthorized migration route to the border, the only travel option available for children who migrate alone to join undocumented relatives in the US. Then 15-year-old Joselyn was apprehended at the border and admitted as an unaccompanied minor. She was detained in an Office of Refugee Resettlement shelter, where she would spend 6 months in detention before finally joining her aunt in Los Angeles. Upon release, Joselyn was one of the few lucky youths who were assigned a free immigration attorney paid for by the US government. And yet, despite her formally protected status, and even with high-quality legal representation, Joselyn would face an arduous journey to legal status and lasting protection. Despite the fact that Joselyn had escaped from violence, her attorney told her she had slim odds of winning her asylum case and advised that instead she apply for something called special immigrant juvenile status, a form of immigration relief for children who've been abandoned, abused, or neglected by one or both of their parents. And Joselyn qualified for this because she had been abandoned at birth by her father. The process was longer, the attorney said, but Joselyn was far more likely to win her case and eventually become a permanent resident and then a US citizen. But when I met her, Joselyn was 18 years old and still in legal limbo, waiting for the result of her case. She had crossed the threshold of the age of majority, but she was still unable to legally work. Her rite of passage to adulthood on hold, even as a young immigrant in the United States. So my book centers the experiences and perspectives of youths like Joselyn and the advocates who help them navigate the immigration system. I demystify the highly politicized yet complex and little understood asylum process, specifically as it applies to the experiences of children who are a growing group of asylum seekers worldwide. I demonstrate that the common sense understanding of asylum as a form of protection for people who fear returning to their homes is actually nothing like the way the asylum law in action works. To qualify, youths must show that they experienced enough of the right types of suffering, ones that fit narrow, contradictory, and infantilizing legal frames. So to give you just one example, while experiences of child abuse tend to create successful asylum cases, being targeted and forcibly recruited by gangs, which is a common experience in Central America, generally leads to unsuccessful asylum case, which is likely to be denied. In addition to satisfying these eligibility categories, youths must also elicit the compassion of asylum officers and other bureaucrats who see them as deserving of protection only if they embody this one-dimensional identity as a helpless child devoid of agency and dependent on adults. In the book, I show that under some conditions, attorneys can challenge these rigid legal frames and expand eligibility categories. But most often, these categories are actually perpetuated through organizational practices and legal strategies. And as a result, too many youths with very real vulnerabilities face lengthy legal limbo in the US at best, and risk deportation back to home countries where they face life-threatening danger at worst. So in the United States, unaccompanied minors embody a dual liminal state. As asylum seekers, they're in legal limbo between protected refugee status and deportable illegality. As teenagers, they're still children from a legal perspective, but they inhabit a liminal state between the social positions of childhood and adulthood. And indeed, as we saw in Joselyn's case, many were on the cusp of their life course transitions in their home countries when these were interrupted by violence. And the legal and social dimensions of youth's liminality interact. So in my talk today, I'll demonstrate that both the result of youth's applications for immigration relief and how long these applications are pending and the timing with which they are granted affects when and how youths can take steps towards continuing their life course transitions in the United States. So before I present the findings, let me just briefly outline kind of two of the book's interventions in existing migration scholarship. So the lack of coming of age opportunities in various countries in the developing world through work, marriage, or child rearing has created what scholars call a culture of migration that's really specific to children and young people. And past scholarship has conceptualized the independent migration of adolescents from these countries as a rite of passage to adulthood. So the argument goes that by migrating to places with more resources and opportunities, youths emancipate themselves from adult controls, they access jobs, and they find ways to support themselves and their families and gain status in their communities of origin. These studies, however, were based solely on the experiences of male labor migrants. And in part, this was because in the past, these flows of independent teen migrants were indeed really male-dominated. So these were studies conducted like 20 years ago. But today, roughly 1/3 of unaccompanied minors are actually girls who arrive in the US. So today, I'll discuss variations by gender in youth's experiences and coming-of-age trajectories in the United States. Now, also unlike these past flows, youths today migrate in a context of heightened immigration control. So after escaping violence in their home countries, upon arrival to the US, they have to successfully navigate these high-stakes applications for asylum to be allowed to remain. So in my book, I show that these applications are inherently victimizing and infantilizing. They require youths to discursively distance themselves from markers of adulthood in their narratives, in other words, in the stories they tell about why they fled, and to present themselves to be as childlike as possible. As a result, I argue that unlike past flows, unaccompanied minors' migration experiences today are not necessarily emancipatory, nor do they guarantee a clear pathway to adulthood. Instead, unaccompanied minors undergo what I call a rite of reverse passage. The ritual that marks the transitions between these two stages of the life course is basically reversed. To elicit compassion and seek protection from their in-between state, teenagers have to regress to childhood rather than move forward to adulthood. So in the chapter I'll present to you today, I argue that the right of reverse passage isn't just discursive and taking place in the realm of applications for asylum, but instead the legal process spills over to affect youth's behaviors and their decisions in their everyday lives as they adapt to their new homes. So the study of how immigrant children adapt to the host country has really been the domain of scholars of assimilation, who've identified acculturation as a key mechanism that leads to positive assimilation outcomes like educational attainment. And yet unaccompanied minors' experiences in the US differ from the assimilation model in important ways. In this model, acculturation is a process of social learning that takes place slowly over time, emerging from everyday interactions that take place largely in inclusive institutions like the K-12 public education system. On the other hand, unaccompanied minors arrive as older teens, so they spend far less time in K-12, and instead they interact intensively with the immigration bureaucracy from the moment when they first step foot on US soil. They're socialized quickly as they navigate this maze-like legal process and pursue these applications for asylum and SIGIS that requires specific knowledge of complex laws that lay people typically don't possess. So taking these differences into account, I shift attention away from processes of acculturation to instead propose the analytic lens of legal socialization that I borrow from research in criminology, and it's defined here on the slide. So legal socialization occurs through interactions and institutions based on rules and relationships of authority. And interestingly enough, while learning about the law is an important part of growing up in society, this has really been neglected in the study of immigrant children's adaptation. So most studies of legal socialization focus on things like how are Black children socialized vis-a-vis their interactions with the institutions like the police. So in my book, I trace the legal socialization of unaccompanied minors as they interact with immigration bureaucrats and their immigration attorneys who teach them about these complex laws and bureaucratic systems. Learning about the law is crucial for kids' chances of success in the asylum process. And yet, despite lawyers' best attempts, in the book, I show that a lot of knowledge gaps persist, and the asylum process remains really disempowering one for these children, who learn much more about the risks they face due to punitive immigration enforcement than about their rights as a protected category under US immigration law. So to write this book, I spent over 4 years conducting ethnographic fieldwork in various nonprofit migrant-serving legal aid organizations in Los Angeles, where I shadowed immigration attorneys and other staff members as they helped almost 80 Central American unaccompanied minors apply either for asylum or SIGIS, as well as navigate challenges outside the legal realm. And I was also really an active participant in the process I was studying because I was essentially trained as a legal volunteer. So I worked as a paralegal in these organizations, helping attorneys prepare cases. I also conducted interviews with unaccompanied minors from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, their family members, and their attorneys. And the research spans and compares the Obama and Trump administrations. So before I proceed to the findings, I just wanted to give you an idea of the broader scope of the projects with an outline of the contents of the book. So chapter 2 is set in Central America, and it describes how youths make migration decisions in context of violence. Chapter 3 describes how youths experience detention in the infamous cages at the US-Mexico border and in so-called shelters for unaccompanied minors run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. In chapter 4, I describe youths' first encounters with the immigration court system and the challenges they face in finding an attorney who will represent them. And this is a challenge because there's actually no public defender system in US immigration court, and not even children are guaranteed a free immigration attorney in the United States. And while there is some funding for legal aid organizations like the one that represented Joselyn, children's demand for legal services far outpaces the available supply. So chapter 5 next describes how attorneys help children apply for asylum and SIGIS. And today I'll present chapter 6 of the book, which sort of zooms out to show how the legal process spills over to affect other facets of youth's lives as they navigate school, work, and family reunification. I'll tell you about how youths come of age under the gaze of the state, while they were waiting increasingly long periods of time for the results of their applications for asylum and SIJs, or special immigrant juvenile status. So for context, when I started my field work in 2015 under the Obama administration, it could take less than 6 months for an unaccompanied minor to get the result of her asylum case. Under Trump, applications for asylum were taking much, much longer, over a year or even 2 to be resolved. And applications for SIJs, which is what Joselyn applied for, were taking even longer, over 3 or 4 years. So I'll present 2 sets of findings from Chapter 6 today. First, I'll describe how case managers help their young clients navigate challenges outside the immigration realm, and in doing so, play a role in youth's legal socialization, further imposing the infantilizing expectations of the legal process and making kids acutely aware of state scrutiny. And just for context, case managers are nonprofit staff members in these legal clinics that assist attorneys not in the legal process, but rather in helping kids navigate all of those extra legal challenges, right? All of the other challenges they face in their lives while their cases are ongoing. In other chapters of the book, I talk about attorneys and immigration bureaucrats' roles in the legal socialization process. And so I'm happy to answer questions about this in the Q&A if you're interested. Secondly, I'll tell you about how within these infantilizing constraints of the legal process, unaccompanied minors make coming-of-age decisions while their immigration cases are pending, as well as how these decisions and behaviors are patterned by gender. All right. So in the summer of 2015, some of you might remember that the Trump administration separated thousands of Central American children from their parents at the border. That summer, the legal clinics where I did my research in Los Angeles suddenly received a veritable outpouring of support from individuals, nonprofits, churches, and even businesses like Uber, all of whom wanted to help the immigrant children that they had seen in the news. And yet these organizations almost exclusively served older teenagers who had arrived in the United States alone. A local group of philanthropists had offered this organization where I was doing my field work to provide in-kind donations to their clients that would be funded through an Amazon wishlist account. And so the case managers decided that a Honduran unaccompanied minor whose name was Linda should be the first of their clients to receive the aid. Not only was Linda in great need, because unlike most unaccompanied minors, she had no family at all anywhere in the United States, but she was also, quote, a sweet kid who case managers knew would be a good face for the organization. Linda was pretty and charismatic, and she had just turned 18, but she was petite and usually didn't wear any makeup, so she really looked younger than her age. Clients like Linda allowed case managers to strategically manage donors' expectations, presenting an example of the unaccompanied minor that wasn't too discordant from the image of the small and compassionate child that was separated from her parents at the border. And yet when the case manager asked Linda to go to the Amazon website to create her wish list, Linda lost her standing as a sweet kid because she failed to comply with these normative, infantilizing, and gendered behavioral expectations. A few days later, the case manager laughed as she told me about the items that Linda had picked. She said, "You have no idea the things she sent me, like black stilettos, super short miniskirts. People aren't going to donate that. The idea is that she is an unaccompanied minor. I thought she could ask for sanitary pads because then people are going to be like, she needs that and can't afford it. Poor thing." The case manager then advised Linda to pick a different set of items, ones that would allow her to present herself as a poor kid, because she thought that only that image would elicit compassion and aid from the donors. And I do want to emphasize that the case manager wasn't providing this advice because it reflected her own beliefs about appropriate female behavior. I had known her for years. She was the Latina child of immigrant parents and an outspoken feminist and immigrants' rights advocate. But she was also a pragmatist who knew that, especially for these types of initial requests, the innocent self-presentation of youth was a strategic means to establish longer-lasting relationships with donors that could benefit more clients and supplement the organization's scarce resources. So even if the case manager didn't personally agree with these gendered messages about how kids like Linda should look and behave, in this way, she inevitably transmitted and reified these notions of deservingness based on childlike innocence. While Central American boys are readily criminalized, it was easier for girls to appear innocent and hence deserving of protection and support, but only if they didn't demonstrate a woman-like sexuality. By telling her to change her wish list, the case manager reminded Linda that as an unaccompanied minor, she was allowed needs, but not desires. The one-dimensional identity as a helpless refugee child leaves little room for the aspirations and desires that young people typically express during their transitions to adulthood. So when their clients turned 18 and were thus legally speaking adults who could have been self-sufficient but didn't always have the tools and resources to achieve this goal, case managers really struggled with how much to both help and discipline their young clients. So Christina, for example, had recently turned 18, and she had been living with her aunt in Los Angeles, but her aunt had just left the country to return to El Salvador to take care of a sick relative. So the case managers were very worried that Christina risked homelessness now that she could no longer rely on her aunt. So they found her temporary housing with a volunteer from a local church. One day, the volunteer called the case manager to report that Christina had taken pictures of herself in her underwear and sent them to boys. After a few days, we learned that Christina had skipped school to hang out with her friends, and she lied about where she was. After these episodes, the case manager reprimanded Christina, telling her, "You don't have the privilege to do that. Do you realize that you're representing all unaccompanied minors now? We found you housing for a month, but if you don't cooperate, you do realize that you'll be homeless after that. It's not my job to find you a place to stay. It's yours." So notice that, unlike the previous example of Linda, in this case, the case manager is imposing adult-like expectations on Christina, who's the same age as Linda, telling her that she should be responsible and fend for herself. Further, through comments like, "You are representing all unaccompanied minors now," the presence of the state's gaze in youth's lives was amplified, reinforcing their impressions that their actions were continuously being scrutinized. So immigration attorneys advise their young clients about how to look and behave in spaces that were where they were especially visible to the state, right? So such as an immigration court or at the asylum office. They thus made youths aware that their behavior and that their demeanor could push their cases towards denial or approval based on discretionary criteria and how bureaucrats perceive them. By assisting youths with their needs outside the immigration process, case managers both reinforce these messages and transfer their significance to the realm of everyday life. So since they continuously received messages like this from various actors, youths became acutely aware of state scrutiny, as exemplified by my own conversation with Linda, the young girl who wanted the black stiletto heels. One day I was sitting with Linda in a park, and she was telling me about her experience in school. Abruptly, Linda became serious and changed topics, and she told me, "You have to be really careful. You have to follow the laws. There's lots of things that one can't do. Immigration is seeing the things that I'm doing. They have my case number. They have all my information. They know everything I'm doing." So even when she was in school, far from the asylum office, youths like Linda came to feel like their every move was being watched. And it is true, mind you, that unaccompanied minors are subjected to intense scrutiny while their immigration cases are pending, right? They're essentially in a probationary state, and making just one mistake can really have high stakes, including deportation. So attorneys and case managers were reinforcing these behavioral norms and teaching their young clients about the law as a means to protect them from immigration enforcement. And case managers contributed to the legal socialization of youth by teaching them about laws that were not strictly related to the immigration process, but that could nonetheless have an impact on their cases. For example, they had awkward conversations about sex with their male clients who were nearing age 18. They informed them that, under US law, having sex with a minor is considered statutory rape. One day, a case manager had this conversation with two Salvadoran brothers, ages 16 and 18. The younger brother looked absolutely mortified, blushing and looking down at his feet, while the older brother, whose name was Marcos, laughed loudly and said, quote, "That's not a problem for me. My girlfriend is 18," to which the case manager replied, "Okay, then, just make sure that you treat her well so you don't get in trouble." Tellingly, the case manager noted that Marcos should treat his girlfriend with respect, not to have a conversation about consent, but rather to make sure that he avoid trouble that could negatively affect his chances of winning his immigration case by committing an illegal act of domestic violence or sexual abuse. So while Linda's sexuality was seen as problematic because of her seductiveness, Marcos' sexuality was framed as potentially violent and problematic in criminal terms. And of course, these gendered frames and narratives of threat around sexuality really resonate with other current and historical examples of stereotypes that are wielded against other groups of immigrants and racial minorities in the US and in other countries as well. And this example also shows you how unaccompanied minors aren't just subject to infantilizing expectations, but they're also and often simultaneously criminalized and adultified. And this is particularly true for boys in a US context where youths of color, citizens and immigrants alike, are more broadly criminalized and stigmatized as inherently deviant, and where we have a discriminatory juvenile justice system that's more likely to adultify and deny the protections normally afforded to children, to Black and Latino youth. So faced with these competing pressures and contradictory expectations, the coming of age trajectories that youth chose to pursue in the United States were gendered. Boys were more likely to privilege work over school sooner, and they often sought out work with the goal of becoming independent from adult caretakers, both in the US and in their home countries. Girls, on the other hand, were more likely to conform to infantilizing expectations and prioritize school over work for longer, as well as to live with their family members for longer, even after entering the workforce. Now, of course, youths had pre-migration goals and aspirations, right? Some were more work-oriented and some were more school-oriented. And some of these youths stuck to their pre-migration plans, while others changed their minds once they arrived in the US, their plans shifting from school to work or vice versa due to a combination of outside pressures, newfound individual aspirations, or a combination of the two. But sadly, what all of these youths had in common was that they faced challenges in pursuing either of their desired coming-of-age trajectories. Now, school has been identified as a key institution for the inclusion of the children of immigrants and undocumented youth who migrate at a young age. But both of these groups tend to enter K-12 during the more inclusive elementary school years. Unaccompanied minors, on the other hand, arrive as older teens and enter high school, the part of K-12 where class and race inequalities are generally amplified. and where they also face unique additional vulnerabilities at virtually each stage of the educational trajectory. So to begin, unaccompanied minors bring disadvantages with them from their home countries. Many hadn't been in school for months or even years prior to migration. Some had dropped out, like Joselyn, due to gang violence, and others had dropped out at a young age to work and help support their families. Once in Los Angeles, youths face obstacles when enrolling in school because they lacked the necessary documents or they lacked familiarity with the US school system. Once in school, language barriers were, of course, a major challenge, and unaccompanied minors who brought few academic skills with them from their home countries often had little to do except attend English language courses for newcomers, which do not count as credit towards high school completion. When youths turned 18, high school administrators often pushed them out, telling them to go to adult school instead. And this happened both when kids had made little progress towards the high school degree, but also sometimes for no apparent reason, even if they were doing really well. So case managers and legal clinics really did their best to prevent these pushouts by educating their young clients about their rights. So under California law, if you enter high school before age 18, you're allowed to stay until age 21 to finish your high school degree. And this extra time is really precious for unaccompanied minors who are entering US schools as older teens and need that time to catch up. And sometimes we did see the fruits of this kind of legal education work, and kids who had been told about their rights in school stood up to administrators who tried to push them out. Now, finally, unaccompanied minors who had dreams of higher education faced an especially insurmountable obstacle. They were ineligible for aid for college, financial aid, due to the timing of their arrival and unique state of legal limbo. So this was the case for Elena, an unaccompanied minor from Honduras who fled her country and arrived in the US at age 16. Elena excelled in high school academically and socially. She had a high GPA, a leadership role in student organizations, and she was even prom queen during her senior year, the prototypically American coming-of-age experience of movies. Elena dreamt of being the first in her family to go to college. She applied and got into 2 University of California campuses. Had her asylum case been approved by then as a refugee, Elena would have qualified for financial aid, for federal financial aid. And yet, when the time came to apply for it, the asylum case she had filed 2 years earlier was still pending. Now, Elena also did not qualify for discounted in-state tuition and financial aid from the state of California for undocumented students. And this is because the California DREAM Act requires students to have spent at least 3 years in California high schools to qualify. And this inclusive law was introduced thanks to the pressures from undocumented youth activists in the Dreamers social movements, but it rarely benefits recently arrived unaccompanied minors who just have different experiences. So at this critical time in her life, when Elena was making plans to go to college, she was neither a dreamer nor a refugee. Without federal aid, it was too expensive for her to afford tuition, even with the partial scholarship that she won. She got discouraged and ended up renouncing her spot, and instead took a job at a meatpacking plant, where she was still working 2 years later when I spoke to her again. In the meantime, Elena's asylum case was approved, and she was a recognized refugee, but she had since abandoned her dreams of college. At the meatpacking plant, Elena had a stable, if unpleasant and dangerous job with relatively good salary and benefits. She still lived with her family, and she now helped to pay household expenses. Now, work-oriented unaccompanied minors also faced several challenges, including compulsory education laws, which in California apply till age 18, and these normative expectations and pressures to study, right? Particularly in this context in the United States, where the Dreamers generation of immigrant youths has really claimed deservingness of inclusion as academic high achievers, right? Based on these middle-class values and ideals about meritocracy. So my respondents told me that these prohibitions and these expectations really made them feel stuck in the phase of childhood, or inadequate when they decided to work. Further, unsurprisingly, having a work permit while your case was pending was really, really important for youths who wanted to work. So asylum seekers are granted work permits while they apply for their cases and wait for results. And back then, it didn't take that long as it takes now to get a work permit. But instead, during the time of my research, CIGIS applicants like Joselyn were forbidden from working during the whole time that their applications were pending. And this has since changed, and I'm happy to tell you more about it during the Q&A. But since at the time it took so long to get a response on a CIGIS case, 3, sometimes 4 years. So if an unaccompanied minor applied, let's say at age 16 or 17, she often wouldn't become a permanent resident with a right to work until age 19 or 20 or 21. So complying with these rules meant postponing entry into the labor force, sometimes far beyond the legal age of adulthood. So some attorneys and case managers told youth with pending CIGIS cases not to work under any circumstances. Yet others, well aware that youths were in financial need and had no option but to work, were willing to give them more nuanced legal advice like this. I'm going to remind you that you can't work. But for me, the most important thing is that you don't work with fake papers, because that can affect your case. So legal clinic staff thus let youths know that while using fake or borrowed papers was illegal, considered immigration fraud and identity theft, respectively, working without authorization in the informal economy is more of an extra legal gray zone. And many CIGIS applicants did work in the informal economy. But of course, without papers, fake, real, or borrowed, it was much more difficult for youths to find jobs that would allow them to adequately support themselves. So they were channeled into these exploitative, dangerous jobs, adding to the challenges that minors already face in the workplace in the US, right? Which is a topic that's garnered a lot of attention recently with these exposés by the New York Times journalists. So these challenges in the workplace are in the realm of work, rather, are exemplified by the case of Filipe from Guatemala, who had come to the US with hopes to continue his studies, moving in with an uncle. Filipe was disappointed to discover that despite his promises, his uncle would in fact not be able to support him because he was already providing for his own children in Guatemala. So paying rent, expenses, and the $7,000 debt that Filipe owed for his journey was really difficult for him, since the only work he could find was as a day laborer. He worked only very sporadically because employers didn't want to hire this minute 15-year-old who seemed, quote, too small to work, in Filipe's words, in physically taxing manual labor. Filipe never showed up to court or applied for asylum because his uncle didn't give him the notice to appear letter with the time and date of his hearing in court. Young and undocumented, for a few years, Filipe worked only about 2 to 3 times a week, making $9 an hour on average. He eventually left the apartment he shared with his uncle and moved around the state, looking for work and working various precarious jobs and facing housing insecurity. Eventually, he found housing in a shelter for immigrant children where he was able to access the resources he needed to continue his education and pursue his immigration case. And thanks to this help, when I met him at age 20, Filipe was about to graduate high school. He had learned English, and he had his work permit, which allowed him to find a better paying and more stable job in a restaurant in Beverly Hills. So in the United States, unaccompanied minors entered 2 types of families, right? So we call them unaccompanied, it's a legal category, but actually the vast majority of these youths have a family member in the US. So they either reunite with parents from whom they've long been separated, sometimes for over 10 years, or they go and live with other family members who they usually barely knew. And these relatives are almost always undocumented. And they sign these formal contracts with the state, with ORR, to get custody of their children, agreeing to ensure that their children comply with US immigration law. And most family members took these obligations quite seriously and quite strictly controlled the unaccompanied minors in their care. So youth's family reunification experiences were also very gendered. Boys were more likely than girls to report conflict with their families in the United States. And after experiencing conflict, boys were more likely to leave the homes of their caretakers than girls. And that's not all that surprising, given that traditional gender norms tie females more closely to the family than males. But what was really interesting was that boys expressed two contradictory reasons for leaving their family members' homes. Sometimes they resented the control that relatives wanted to have over their lives, reflecting their desire to feel like adults and be independent. Other times, however, their motivations reflected a childlike desire for dependency. Like Filipe, they had expected the adults in their life to provide for them, and when they were unable to do so, this made youths feel abandoned and betrayed. And these contradictory feelings, which most boys actually felt at the same time, really reflect how youths experience their liminal position in the United States, suspended between childhood and adulthood. So to conclude, as they partake in the legal socialization of youths, case managers both teach them about the law and impose these infantilizing or contradictory behavioral expectations. They also contribute to making youths hyper-aware of the gaze of the state in their everyday lives, beyond their interactions with the immigration system. So past scholarship has portrayed youth migration as a process that takes place outside state systems and features opportunities for youth to exercise agency and pursue their aspirations and goals for the future. In contrast, I've argued that migration is instead a rite of reverse passage for unaccompanied minors, whose migration experiences take place under the gaze of the state and are hence not necessarily emancipatory, but rather characterized by subordination and delayed transitions to adulthood. The legal and social dimensions of youth's liminality interact. Prolonged legal limbo yields heightened liminality in youth's life course transitions, delaying or disrupting plans to enter the workforce or pursue higher education. By incorporating a gender analysis that's missing in past studies of independent youth migration, I've also shown you that within these infantilizing constraints, youth's coming of age trajectories and decisions are gendered, with girls more likely to be compliant and behave in childlike ways than boys. Ultimately, for all of these youths who are escaping violence in their home countries and migrating in a context of heightened immigration control, legal status is indispensable for them to be able to pursue their dreams and aspirations and to find lasting refuge and stable futures in their new homes. So thank you very much for your attention. And before I stop sharing, I just wanted to share, before I stop sharing my screen, I just wanted to share the promo code if you want to buy the book from the editor with a discount. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Chiara. Great presentation, very informative. Any questions, comments, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And, while we're waiting for that, I have a question, of course. As you talk about this, like these contradictory narratives that they experience that, on one hand, infantilize them, position them as, one-dimensional young people. And then on the other hand, adultify them, criminalize them, along with this idea of the reverse passage. I'm wondering, do you have a sense of how the young people themselves experience their coming of age? How do they understand themselves? Do they understand themselves as being adolescents, adults, as doing a reverse passage, as being infantilized or adultified. I'm wondering to what extent they themselves identified the contradictions that you're discussing.
Yeah, I think that they definitely feel infantilized and express a lot of frustrations with the fact. So I guess that for the work-oriented use, this is like especially apparent, and they brought it up many, many times, particularly the boys, right? Like expressing these frustrations of, why do I have to go to school? Or I did this interview with a young man from with a boy from Guatemala who then became a young man in foster care, right? He had no family in the US, so he was placed in long-term foster care. And he told me all about all of the fights that he had with the woman who was entrusted with his care, right, in the foster family, and about these different ideas about what a valuable life was, right? And he really pushed back when she told him, you're supposed to be in school. If you don't go to college, you're going to be a nobody. And he's like, he was saying, of course I can be a somebody. I migrated to this country. I can learn all these skills through work. I can't wait to get started. Like, I want to be able to support my mother who is back home. She's been providing for me my whole life, and now it's my turn, right? So kind of this really desire to progress in the life course transitions, and a lot of frustrations with being denied those opportunities. But at the same time, like, as I mentioned, also they expressed these contradictions. And I'm not sure the extent to which they express the contradictions of, like, also sometimes wanting to be protected and feeling abandoned, because they were aware of the infantilizing contradictory frames that were imposed on them or whatever. I think that's just more like the virtue of coming of age itself, right? And this liminal stage in the life cycle, right? When you're a teenager, you start to try on parts of adulthood, right? You buy the black stiletto heels or whatever. You take all of these small steps, but you also remain, it's kind of an amorphous period. So you take a few steps forward, a few steps back. And so they were very much just being teenagers at the same time,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So in the chat, if you can maybe put the link to the book in the chat, that'd be great. That way they can access it. And then I'm just going to read off a comment here. There are similar stories in other parts of the world. I wonder if these kinds of findings are specific to cultures involved in your studies, or whether this would apply in different settings. And then specifically thinking about Syrian refugees coming to Greece or to Europe in general.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that question. So I've dropped the link to the book in the chat. That's a great question. So I'm actually Italian, and I started working on migration issues in the European Union, and I started getting interested in unaccompanied minors reading the European scholarship. So this is very, very similar to what happens in Europe. And, this scholarship on the rite of passage is based on studies from all over the world. So, children migrating from African context, from Afghanistan, the Middle East, from Latin America, to the US, to Europe. The thing that's different, right, that's changed from, at least from like the rite of passage kind of literature is, as I was mentioning briefly, is I really think that those were more labor migrations, scholarship done in the 80s and 90s. We didn't have like such a severe immigration control apparatus in place. And so, young migrants were more free to kind of, access all of the opportunities of migration, similarly to the ones that adults access, right? So I do think that's changed. And that's very much also the case with unaccompanied minor phenomenon in Europe, right? So these are children who are hyper controlled from the moment when they first arrive in places like Greece, but also Italy. There's a lot of these children, the UK, and in part they're ultra controlled because it's a way to protect them, right? They're without their parents, so they're placed in these shelters. They can actually leave, unlike the US shelters that are detention facilities, and they're jails because they can't leave. But children report all sorts of negative experiences in those contexts, and that's been widely documented by the scholarship. Similar feelings of frustrations with delayed transitions to adulthood. So this is very much something that is applies to other experiences in the European context as well. I'll say there's one fundamental difference between the US legal framework and the European legal framework, at least, as it pertains to most EU countries, which is that the US context is just much more punitive. I mean, we force unaccompanied children to be in removal proceedings in immigration court where they have to fight for their right to stay in the US, something that they can't do without an attorney, and yet we don't even give them access to an attorney. Otherwise, we just send them home. So we treat them like adults, essentially, right? There's some protections, but they aren't as strong as protections that exist in Spain and Italy, where, unaccompanied minors are protected from deportation usually until age 18. They're given these residency permits. Of course, the problems start when you turn 18, but at the very least, there's some recognition of the fact that they're children and we should protect them, at the very least, while they are children. So, in the conclusion of my book, I have some policy recommendations, and one of them is, to look to the European context, to, borrow some of these more protective and less punitive laws that exist there. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you, Chiara. Just to finish off, last question here. We're just a couple minutes out. You talked about your research took place during the Obama and Trump. Of course, now, we continue to have migration. There's been a focus on more like Venezuelan arrivals, asylum seekers, families. But unaccompanied minors, of course, also continue to come. I'm wondering if you think about the current moment, is there anything different? Has anything changed that might be shaping their experiences differently for current arrivals?
In some ways, things have improved under the Biden administration. So in a couple ways. So first of all, and nothing ever improves because the administration is kind and generous and wants to give people something for free. Things always improve thanks to the tireless work of immigration advocates. So one of major advocacy victory was that now children who have a pending CIGIS application are able to get a deferred action with a work permit. So this is hugely important for, helping kids like Joselyn, progress in their coming of age transitions, get jobs that aren't as exploitative. So that's something that's improved quite a bit. And then, the Trump administration really restricted the eligibility categories for asylum for all asylum seekers in ways that really affected Central Americans, including these children. And Obama has, Biden has in many ways returned the state of asylum law to the Obama era status quo. So it's better than Trump, but at the same time, even the Obama era status quo was problematic with an asylum law that's far too narrow to protect, children who are really escaping from conditions of life-threatening violence in their home country. So, we have a long, long way to go. Not to mention how oversaturated, like, all of the bureaucracies are. That's creating problems for people of all ages, right? So this kind of state of limbo is being exacerbated for unaccompanied children, for adults, for just about anyone who's in the immigration process right now.
Thank you, Chiara. So with that, we'll come to a close. And again, just want to thank you so much for presenting to the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood. And thanks everybody who attended. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.